very much for coming. I know the beginning of term, particularly this term, is always a pretty harassing time for people. I am simply going to introduce one of the sponsors of this seminar. You will know, I'm sure, about the Centre for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRASSH, which is one of our sponsors here. The second is the fairly newly established Centre for Governance and Human Rights, which is particularly involved in the subject matter of this debate. And I represent the third body, which is called CARA nowadays. When it had its first connections with Cambridge back in the 1930s, it was known after a few months as the Society for the Promotion of Science and Learning. And it was responsible at that time for bringing out people from Germany when Hitler had closed the universities to Jews and others who regarded as undesirable in academic life. And so Lord Beveridge and others, including A.V. Hill, who became a Nobel Prize winner in physiology and is professor here, John Maynard Keynes, and others, set up this body to help academic refugees to make the transition from one university system into another. And those people were incredibly good for Britain. They were incredibly good for Britain because amongst them were 18 Nobel Prize winners. They were incredibly good for me personally because my father was very active in the war, and I spent my childhood years with refugees from Austria, physicists from Austria, who were my father and mother figures for my first 3 years of life. So I owe personally a very great deal to the advantages of having academic refugees settle in our country. We hoped, well, I didn't, it was too young, but CARA at that stage hoped that it could stop when the Second World War was over, that there wouldn't be a need to go on. Unfortunately, there has been a need to go on from one crisis to another, from South Africa, Iran, Chile, all sorts of uprisings and difficulties in countries, some of them permanent, so that some people come out to settle here permanently, some of them temporary, so that we hope very much that people will spend their time here helping to prepare to go back and start their country again on their return. And I think that's reflected in our speakers tonight. And we certainly have plans with, we're talking at the moment with universities in Zimbabwe in the hope that before too long it will be possible to rebuild an open civil society in Zimbabwe and a higher education system, which will be as good as the one which used to be there for the present bad days. So that is what CARA is. That is the third sponsor of this occasion. Now I'd like to hand over straight away to Martin Harris, who's going to chair.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome to everybody. It's good to see such a turnout on such an important set of issues. I'm a new member of the Council of CARA, and I'm rather delighted that my first role, my first task in that role is to chair the session this evening. In a moment I'm going to introduce our three speakers. The format this evening will be as follows. Each of the speakers will speak for 7 or 10 minutes. And I'm going to ask if there are any factual questions on what that speaker has said. Please, just factual questions, just 1 or 2 factual questions, so that all three get a good chance to say what they want. And as soon as all three of our colleagues have spoken, then I will throw it open to all of you to talk about what they've said and broader issues as you think fit. And the aim is to spend altogether about an hour and a half, and then there will be a reception for everyone downstairs outside. So, welcome again. Our three speakers, and this is the order in which they're going to speak. Leila Ali Karami, an Iranian lawyer, human rights scholar, and a well-known defender of women's and children's rights in Iran over a number of years. She campaigned for some years against child execution and worked with Nobel Prize winner Shirin Ebadi, defending the politically persecuted. Leila was telling me just now that she's now doing a PhD at SOAS, and stimulating and exciting though that is, it isn't quite the same as what she was doing before she came to Britain. Our second speaker is Gladson Chikwa, a lecturer at Women's University in Harare, and Secretary of the University Union, Gladstone advocated staff rights, which didn't exactly make him very popular with the university authorities, who of course are essentially dominated there by the state. Gladstone initially won a scholarship to study in Spain, and he's now partway through a PhD at the University of Sheffield, the introduction and use of new technologies in language education. And I'm particularly interested personally in what Gladstone says, because I used to do consultancy every year a long time ago at the University of Harare until it became a pointless thing to do. And our third speaker, Mina Alami, is now a visiting fellow at LSE, researching into the media and propaganda of jihadist groups, a lecturer in English language at Baghdad University. Mina had to flee from Iraq to Jordan along with her family in 2006, following a series of serious death threats. So we're going to get three very different perspectives on what it's like to be an academic who can't do his or her research effectively, or a scholar or a lawyer, because of the circumstances in the country in which they find themselves. So our first speaker, Leila Ali-Karami. Leila, over to you.
I'm happy to be here and to talk about the situation of academics in my country, Iran. Freedom of opinion and expression are the fundamental human rights and the first step toward democracy. Democracy has no meanings unless nations are free to express their opinions. Freedom of opinion and belief should always be combined with freedom of expression. In other words, even in non-democratic countries, people are free to think. But what is important is that the human being should be allowed to talk about their beliefs and thoughts without fear of punishment. The most important restriction to the freedom of expression is censor. Censorship exists in most extreme form in Iran. Books or any other media are subject to licensing and written permission from the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. The most important issue of censorship is that the criterion is not clear, and depending on personal taste and opinion of the person who read the book in order to issue the permission. The government and official censorship often leads to another phenomenon, which is self-censorship, saying that the writer or an artist must obtain government approval and permission to publish his work. So, he or she must try not to think and write in a way that his work does not get permission to be published. Therefore, one can claim that the potential literacy and artistic creativity are destroyed. Censorship sometimes is so severe in Iran. For example, according to the Clause 12 of Article 6 of the Press Act, publishing material about the Constitution is not allowed. Recently, it was decided that works which promote nihilism, secularism, and feminism are not allowed to be published. According to the government of Iran, equality of rights between men and women is a Western phenomenon and not compatible with the principle of Sharia. Many websites that promote women's rights were filtered. For example, Change for Equality was launched in September 2006 by groups of about 20 women, mostly bloggers and journalists, to promote a campaign for change to laws that discriminate against women. More than 50 of women's activists have been some arrested and jailed since the site's launch. Iran is one of the countries in which academic freedom is blatantly violated by the government, including the recruitment and employment prospect, warnings against activism, interference with teaching, unwanted transfer to other institutions, dismissal, forced retirement, and resignation of professor. In June 2006, alone 45 secular and liberal professors were forced to retire. Salary cuts, prosecution, travel bans, censorship of professor publication, death threats, abduction, forced disappearance, illegal arrest, beating, torture, assassination by bullets or bombs, or some combination of these. Students have been expelled, barred from registration for classes, denied access to graduate study, persecuted, detained, tortured, and denied the right to assemble peacefully or hold a rally. Student unions and magazines have been shut down, and there has been a general restriction against any student-run organization. Under a new star rating system, politically active students were allegedly rated according to the threat they posed, which resulted in some being banned from studying. Unfortunately, in recent years, many talented students have been disqualified from pursuing their education simply because they have criticized the government. Yet the student movement is more active than other academic groups in objecting to lack of freedom of academics. Every day, there are more statements by Iranian students regarding violations that happen in universities. Their slogan is that university is not military, and students are concerned about their plight and wondering why are they denied the right of education. Are there any Islamic laws that would consider accepting to ruin the future of some talented student by banning them from education? Following the presidential election on 14 June 2009, the Basiji invaded dormitories at Tehran University, attacking students and burning bedrooms. 3 male students and 1 female student were shot dead. On 25 June 2009, 70 university professors were arrested after their meeting with former presidential candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. A succession of academics, teachers, and students have been arrested during the 2007-2009 period on charges of conspiring with enemy government, endangering national security, insulting Islam and its clerics, intent to commit propaganda, or participate in demonstration. In one incident, in March 2007, some 300 teachers were arrested for protesting about working conditions. Threats, beatings, arrests, and dismissal of academics have become a commonplace across Iran. These are some examples of difficulties that academics have encountered in my country, Iran. But is it possible for all who are in danger to leave the country and find a new place to live? Some of the university professors and students are banned from traveling. Therefore, they cannot leave the country legally. For others who can leave the country, will their problems be over after leaving the country? The answer is no. It will be a new story, new struggle. How one can concentrate on his or her work when his or her colleagues are at risk of being executed because of their beliefs? How is it possible to work when one is not in a clear situation? For example, is it the situation of a refugee academic as same as the situation of his or her English colleagues? In my opinion, the answer is no. I have asked this question from one of my colleagues. She has told me that here is not my home. I don't even speak in my own language. My family, my friends, my colleagues are not here. I am detached from the sources of my work, and I'm always asking this question: what shall I do after finishing my study? Am I able to find a job? What will happen in my country? When will I be able to come back to my country? When I will be able to see my family? It is really good that some organizations provide financial support for academics that are endangering their own country and help them to leave their country and settle in another country. At least this academic can survive financially. But what the number of academics who have survived in this way? 100, 1,000? Therefore, it is not possible to rescue all the academics in this way. I think the international community should put more pressure on the countries that violate the freedom of academics to oblige them to respect their freedoms. As for Iran, we believe that Iran should respect the freedom of expression And we urge the Islamic Republic of Iran to comply with its international obligation, namely Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the right to freedom of expression, and with Iranian domestic law, especially with Article 24 and 168 of the Constitution on freedom of expression and Article 26 of freedom of association. And we are committed to applying pressure on our government to live up to these commitments, including the guarantee of freedom of expression. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this event where we are discussing one very important issue at the moment. And I'm happy to share my experiences as a Zimbabwean. So I'm going to try to be brief. I'll divide my presentation into two sections. The first part, I'll try to highlight the general characteristics of the situation obtaining in Zimbabwe. And in the second part, I'll share briefly my personal experiences as both a postgraduate student in Zimbabwe and a lecturer at university in Zimbabwe. I will start by advancing one piece of truth that I think most of you might be familiar with, especially if you follow the news. Zimbabwe has been on the cards in the past and maybe even up to this day. There is a political crisis in Zimbabwe and a gross violation of human rights. And these two facts have impacted seriously on the question of academic freedom, leading to a significant reduction of the scope for free inquiry. While on paper, the Constitution talks of freedom of expression, in reality this has remained largely a pipe dream or a mirage. Freedom of expression does not exist, and I would like to underline that most of the scholars in the country are at risk, especially those with divergent views from the mainstream. They are either tortured, harassed, or killed, depending on the gravity of the matter. And given the situation obtaining in the country, we have had a lot of our intellectual capital going into exile. And that explains the reason why maybe I'm here this evening sharing with you. The government has actively put in place legislation that seeks to limit the country's academic space for free inquiry. I'm going to share with you two of the pieces of legislation that have been put in place in the country that, in my view, has impacted negatively on academic freedom. We've got a law which is called Public Order of Security Act. This act makes it difficult for scholars to carry out research, especially in the rural countryside of the country, which is largely the the core political constituency of the government in power. Under this law, 3 or more people are considered to be a crowd, and it is illegal under the law for you to come together to constitute a gathering. So, like I said earlier on, this has got serious implications, especially when it comes to research activities, where maybe a university lecturer would have to work with a group of assistants going into different parts of the country. So you will need to make an application for a clearance to be allowed to do that, which in most cases is not granted. So we have had many researchers being harassed or tortured by the youth militia if they try to go and get some primary data from the countryside. A little bit more about this act. If you want to hold, for example, an academic workshop, seminar, or conference, you will need to make an application, and you will need something like 2 months to make that application, maybe for a workshop which lasts only for 1 hour. And when you make that application, you need to submit the program of the workshop and the expected attendees so that the authorities know who exactly will be coming. And it has been a normal practice in such circumstances that even if you succeed to hold the conference or workshop, there will be members of the Central Intelligence Organization tracking whatever is happening there. So it is something that anyone who listens to it might consider to be ridiculous, but it's one of the strategies that the government, led by Robert Mugabe, has put in place to make sure they follow whatever discourses are taking place in the academia. And this has led to the torturing, harassment of academics. Another law that seriously affects academics in Zimbabwe is the Access to Information and Privacy Protection Act, which is called the IPA. I think you will be familiar with this because we had organizations like CNN and the BBC. They were barred officially to enter into Zimbabwe under this law. Of course, recently we've had some changes. So, under this law, all journalists operating in Zimbabwe are required to register with a government-controlled media council. And this council can revoke media house licenses at its own discretion. They sometimes refuse journalists or academics who are perceived to be anti-government. And I've already mentioned the case of CNN and BBC. They were barred under this law. For those in the academia, this law has deeper implications. It is, for example, it is illegal under this law to criticize the president of Zimbabwe. So under such circumstances, how can people like political scientists in universities engage in any meaningful discourses about the country's political life? It becomes very difficult because what happens is in a lecture room. They plant their spies, and if you are going to make any criticism, then you will be put on the list, and what follows is something else. So we have had scores of academics, journalists, and ordinary Zimbabweans being arrested, tortured, and harassed under this law. So scholars, under such circumstances, cannot write, talk, or discuss anything about the crisis in their own country. For example, I cannot write anything critical, as long as I'm in the country. Writing anything or criticizing the government openly would be an application to death, actually, because they can get hold of you anytime. I'm talking of a country where all the state-owned universities are run by the president. He is the chancellor of all the universities. So what happens is all the senior positions in the universities, they are appointed by the president. So you would appoint the vice chancellors, you would appoint head of departments, even the council of the university. So everything is very much under control, and it becomes so difficult for you to exercise any freedom within such circumstances. Well, like I said earlier on, turning to my personal experiences, as a student, I suffered in the same way most of the students continue to suffer even today. Whenever we organized protests against some of the draconian policies that the government was putting in place, we were treated harshly, beaten, tear gases thrown, and they could just come to the university, invade the halls of residence, start throwing tear gases in the corridors and beating students, men or women alike. So they use the police, they use the army, they use the youth militia to deal with the students. I would say there is tension between the intellectual community and the politicians. I think it was aggravated as well because when the opposition party came up, most of the members who were aligned to the opposition came from the universities, and so from there the government just saw all universities to be filled up with enemies. So as a lecturer, I was teaching various courses at university level, and I had to practice self-censoring of the content that I was delivering in the lecture rooms because I knew that there were spies masquerading as students in my lecture rooms. So you are left with no option but to safeguard yourself, so you don't have to be too critical, but you have to say what appeals to them, and as a result you kind of produce affect students in terms of the preparation that you are giving them. Critical thinking and analysis is compromised. So I was also the Secretary General of the Workers' Union in the university, and I became very unpopular. And the authorities were just waiting to find one way of eliminating me from the university, but anyway, I acted earlier, so I had to resign, and I stayed about 3 months without working before I got a scholarship to go to Spain. So this was the experience. It was very difficult, and I'm sure it continues to be difficult even today when we have the inclusive government. They haven't changed anything in particular. So the problems that we faced before the inclusive government are still continuing because this government hasn't been able to change the political apparatus which are run by the President Robert Mugabe. Thank you very much.
My talk will be slightly different from those of my colleagues in that they mentioned state repression or control, which Iraqis had a very generous share of for years. And in my case, it's kind of multi-actor, non-state control after 2003. So my talk is about the contradiction of having freedom of expression on the one hand, but being far too afraid to practice it on the other. Although it was made available, but because of the security situation, no one dared practice it properly, at least in an academic level. So looking at the scene in Iraq following 2003, I think one can safely say that the most prominent freedom was the freedom for individuals and groups to intimidate and harm without any consequences. And that kind of freedom kind of undermined all other freedoms made available for the first time. And so, now a very important point to mention here in this context is that people weren't harmed simply by because of views and ideas they expressed, but it was because of views and ideas they were assumed to hold. So assumptions play a very important role here, and it's even a more dangerous and important development because it's unpredictable. You can't help what people think, and you can't control. You can't anticipate what the judgments and the assumptions they'll make. And that's fine in kind of an environment where violence is not practiced easily, but in this context, anyone can harm you because they don't agree with you, because they dislike you. And that's pretty much how it was in Iraq following 2003. And so, in the absence of the rule of law and state authority, academics were deliberately and specifically targeted by various forms of political violence. It is estimated that around 400 academics were killed, not to mention many others who were kidnapped, tortured, and threatened. This naturally led to an exodus of Iraqi academics on an unprecedented scale. Academics and scholars, they fled to neighboring countries, mostly Syria and Jordan, where again they were unemployed or underemployed. From my department alone, I know I was at the College of Languages English department at the university. And in our department alone, four of my colleagues were threatened, and the common threat being the bullet in an envelope sent to them. And that was because of reasons I'll come to mention now. And they fled to Jordan, as I fled to Jordan as well. And there again, your struggle doesn't end because they're in Jordan. You don't have residence, and you're not a legal resident in Jordan, so you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You can't go back to Iraq because you were threatened there. You were either, in my case, we were literally expelled from our neighborhood, and so it was really hard to go back. But it was a lot of, my talk today is more relevant to the years between 2005 and 2007, when violence peaked. So these were the years where academics really suffered. They still do today, but to a less extent. Just talk about the motivations behind the attacks. Some of them were criminal, which is a very small portion was criminal because intellectuals were kind of assumed to, have more money to pay in ransom. But the majority of them were politically motivated, and the reasons were that because of victims' alleged or real previous or former affiliations, it was really difficult. I remember in our department, so it was hard. So if you were affiliated in some way, even if kind of very superficial way with the Ba'ath regime, which the majority of Iraqis had to be, you were targeted because of that affiliation. And if you were working at you were a lecturer at the department at that time, then you were affiliated with the current government, and that was under the occupation considered illegitimate, hence you are legitimate. And you have all sorts of brands such as infidel. If you dare express opinions saying, well, you don't support the occupation, then you could be branded names such as infidel, takfir, you're with the insurgency. If you say something like, it was much better during the Ba'ath regime, then by virtue you're a Ba'athist, you're a Saddamist. So either way you could be easily targeted. And it's also because of opinions that people expressed, or like I said, didn't express, but people assumed that they held these opinions. And of course you have the sectarian tension, the Sunni-Shia divide, and sectarian tension that was kind of, it characterized a lot of the attacks against academics at the time. My father was one of the academics who was forced to move from Baghdad University to kind of a southern province at a university where he didn't know anyone there. It was new to him, but it was also because of kind of being of a different religious sect, and so that was the case for many Iraqis. The atmosphere in the country was kind of marked by the polarization along religious and political lines, and that normally reflected, reflected on university campuses. So a lot of the political, in their struggle to control institutions in general, a lot of the political parties and groups with their militias try to take control of universities. And so, the majority of these groups had kind of an Islamic character to them, or religious character to them. And they wanted universities to reflect their own ideologies and version of Islam. And many of the students, so these groups kind of interfered in the daily lives of faculty, and they imposed practices that had nothing to do with Islam. So, for example, endless religious holidays were introduced. Walking into campus, it was bizarre for me because I worked there before during the Saddam regime. So it was bizarre to walk in to the university and see these kind of so many posters of religious clerics, and of course in universities that were in kind of Islamic discipline, posters of clerics and those sectarian flags. And of course, female students and staff alike were harassed for not conforming to a certain dress code. I remember that at the time at the University of Mosul, Christian female staff and students were forced to wear the hijab, although they were Christians, but they were forced to do that, and they did. And finally, of course, a lot of students aligned themselves with these groups, either out of conviction or to gain power or to assume a certain identity. So that was very problematic in that context. At the university, because lecturers were intimidated and even restricted in the lectures they gave, and even in the marks they awarded, because of this newly gained power of their students. So I was just sitting here and trying to think, just trying to let you imagine how it is, because during the Ba'ath regime it was different because the enemy was one and you knew your enemy, so Iraqis, including academics, learned how to avoid provoking the enemy, and it was easier, it was predictable. But at this point, there was no state authority, no rule of law. Anyone could do what they wanted to, and kind of a lot of the groups and criminals kind of had the upper hand. So, giving a lecture now, especially if it was in a field of humanities, political science, it would be very difficult to kind of anticipate, to know what each of the people present here, what their kind of political or religious affiliation or thoughts were, and whether they'd agree with me or not, or whether I'd be targeted or not. So this was kind of the atmosphere. It's very hard to deliver a lecture, to kind of have an open debate when you're really worried and trying to read faces and trying to see how you'll get yourself in trouble. So academic freedom and university autonomy in Iraq post-2003 went from tough state control and repression to chaotic multi-actor non-state control. And so amid this atmosphere of intimidation and hostility, how can academics be expected to hold open debates and encourage their students to do so when they are just simply facing a struggle to stay safe on a daily basis, going to work, just delivering lectures and going to work and minding their own business. And how are they to freely and fearlessly express their opinions in lectures and publications and interviews? And can a scholar of science and humanities really question, challenge, receive knowledge and the political status quo, knowing that this might kind of cost him his life, his or her life, or the lives of their loved ones? I just want to say here that although the situation nowadays, following 2007, has relatively improved, as has kind of the security situation in Iraq in general, and I say relatively because there are still there's a lot of violence, there are still the suicide bombings and terrorist attacks everywhere in Iraq. But what I'm interested more, because my research focus is Islamism, radical Islam, Islamic groups. And still these topics are very, very sensitive there, and I think it's very, very unlikely that I would go back into this kind of research there. I don't know any colleagues who are doing this kind of research in Iraq, although it would be the best place, unfortunately, because of those, so many militant groups, Al-Qaeda affiliated or inspired groups in Iraq. It would be the ideal place to do this kind of research. But it would be extremely, extremely dangerous, not only for yourself, but for your family. I'm grateful that I am now sponsored by LSC Scholars at Risk, where I can kind of do my research relatively freely. I can do it freely, which goes back to kind of a point I would kind of like to mention here about kind of academics going out and the difficulties they face. And the research that I do, I collect a lot of material, very radical, extremist material, and I access most of the kind of hardcore jihadist websites. And I'm always kind of concerned, as a Muslim, as an Iraqi on a temporary visa to the UK, will I face trouble with the authorities here because of the kind of research that I do? I know a lot of terrorism acts kind of, they can arrest people who are in possession of radical material, so it's very hard. And I did try, I was at some point on a project that was funded by the SRC, and I did try to get some kind of verbal or kind of preferably written approval that, or just recognition that I am doing this kind of research for the purpose of, academic research. But in all cases, I was told that no such thing could be given because, of course, no one can guarantee what you will do with this material. So although you do this kind of research here, still you are not part of this kind of world. You are from a certain part of the world where there's a lot of violence and terrorism. And so, just to say that the role of academics in spearheading debates and questioning the status quo is needed today in Iraq more than ever, simply because of the big number of groups, political and religious, and ideologies that have surfaced in Iraq in such a very, short period of time. And, when regimes change, an opportunity exists to institutionalize new political and civil rights and norms. And although, despite all the problems in Iraq today, political activism, which was restricted to the Ba'ath Party in the past, it just brings with it a great opportunity for academics and intellectuals and activists and, a lot of people to teach and point out the importance of protecting these civil and political rights. It's an opportunity to normalize tolerance and bring up a generation that appreciates and expects diversity. A generation that is armed with knowledge required to question debates, ideas, practices, and policies. Otherwise, not only will international development progress in the realm of science and humanity pass Iraq, but Iraqis will kind of go back to their previous roles of passive citizens who submit to the will of the strongest. Thank you.